Hi everyone. Today I wanted to talk about Reality Resort, a show I've come to love over time as more and more episodes have dropped. I wanted to just give a brief discussion of the things I like and some of the things I've had issues with as well over the course of the Premerge. This show's probably the most successful total drama-like after Disventure Camp, and has managed to develop its own sizable fandom as well. It was started by Cove in 2024, and hopefully this video will be released just before the 11th episode is released on the 31st of January. Now, just to be clear, while this will not be a plot summary, I am going to need to bring up certain plot elements in order to facilitate this discussion, so this is a blanket spoiler warning for the first 10 episodes of the show. That being said, let's go ahead and do a quick overview of the premise. Reality Resort is meant to be the first season of a presumably 4-season-long arc, where the first 3 seasons will act as shows of their own right, while also serving as a qualifier for the ultimate show Reality Royalty. The top 5 players and legacy points each season will be invited to return for this final season, with the 16th presumably being chosen by audience vote. The pre-merge of the season featured 2 episode blocks, with the challenges of each block having different themes, such as sports, vacation, etc. The first episode of each block features a challenge pitting the teams of exotic emus and tropical toucans in a fight for immunity, additionally an award sometimes as well. After which, the losing team and winning team each vote for one person from the losing team to be put up for elimination. At this point, the 2 players voted by each team enter into a sudden death match where they face off for one last chance to save themselves. Watching it feels like a Big Brother season with a team twist, a la season 11 or season 18, with a dash of the challenge mixed in as well, with that final challenge to save yourself. One thing that I think you'll immediately notice upon watching the first few blocks is that the gameplay already feels much more complex than similar shows I've seen by their 3rd or 4th episode. Aside from a few characters, it feels like everyone has that sort of new age survivor game bodiness to them. That isn't to say none of the characters form deep connections or care socially. I actually think that's one of the best parts of Reality Resort. But unlike Disventure Camp, in Reality Resort, it often feels like the characters are supporting the strategy, rather than the strategy supporting the characters. I think the biggest example of this is in Block 4, where Charles, the character to be eliminated that round, had his arc rushed a little bit, in my opinion, in favor of us seeing the scheming and strategy of VJ and Marcus that caused Charles' elimination to occur. Just to be clear, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, it just often feels different from some of the other shows in this niche, like Total Drama or Disventure Camp. As an avid live-action reality television viewer, Total Drama and Disventure Camp both feel more like they were mimicking the first few seasons of Big Brother or Survivor, where personal drama was much more likely to preempt strategy. On the other hand, if I had to compare Reality Resort to an era of these types of shows, it would probably be the sort of mid-2010 seasons for Big Brother and Survivor, where while personality was still a major factor and did often still win out, strategy was also a preeminent priority for the majority of the cast as well. That's another thing I'd like to offer my praise for. Reality Resort has managed to make the vast majority of their characters not feel solidly good or bad, morally speaking, and as a result, most of their cast feels much more human from that. Additionally, I love that strategy itself is not necessarily exclusively viewed as duplicitous or bad, with most of even the characters who you would consider more quote-unquote good also tend to engage in that kind of talk, which you don't necessarily see much in Total Drama or Disventure Camp in the early episodes of Season 1, aside from your basic alliance form. I also would argue that Reality Resort feels the most like an actual social strategy show that just happened to be animated, with Total Drama and Disventure Camp both having their own sort of whimsy that adds flavors to their respective shows, but does make it feel a bit distinct from a social strategy show. This is tough to talk about because truthfully, I feel as if this reality television realism is simultaneously Reality Resort's greatest strength and greatest weakness. This biggest example of this for me is Kylie's elimination. If this were an actual reality television show, Kylie was screwed since round 2, since she had shown herself to be very capable mentally with her puzzle queen stuff, and her and Cheryl both being outed as the first people to really attempt to rope people into alliances. That would absolutely seal her fate in any reality television show, and as such, it makes sense for her to be eliminated. However, this is where I have to point out the obvious. Reality Resort is not a real reality television show, and as it is a member of a genre involving other shows that tend to prioritize compelling drama and storylines over what ought to happen, I think it creates a small disconnect for the viewers. I think back to stories and total drama like Win vs. Heather, or even the whimsy and fun that Fiore and Alec had in season 1 as villains. For better or for worse, I think you do lose that kind of whimsy and joy that you can have in storytelling when you have such a grounded tone for a traditionally less grounded need. Again, this is not right or wrong, but I do think it is a different thought process for writing from total drama or Disventure Camp, and that comes with its pros and cons. Let's return to that Kylie elimination again. Although I'm sure Cove has plans, currently with the material we have, it feels like a damn shame to have her whimper out one cycle later after she vows to get revenge and immediately finding an idol as well. Finn and Marcus both throwing her under the bus repeatedly to save their games makes sense, but Kylie had a storyline worth keeping for at least a little while longer in my opinion. Additionally, even without seeing the merge and what's in store there, we do know what happens in the rest of the pre-merge, and I can't help but feel as if Kylie had more potential to add for subsequent episodes than Charles or Tino respectively did, who both had either no arc or very minimal arcs that likely would have benefited from having their moments sped up a little in the story. While we're talking about eliminations, that's another issue with Reality Resort. They're having a bit of a problem signaling each elimination long before the final game even begins. Of the first 5 eliminations, by the time of the game, it's extremely easy to see who diegetically makes more sense to stay for plot reasons. The only time this wasn't the case in my opinion was the Cheryl and Kylie elimination, but even that elimination it felt obvious who would win in story due to how much they were talking about Kylie being a puzzle queen, and Cheryl struggling, and all of this just making extremely clear that Cheryl probably wasn't making it out of the round. This isn't to say that every elimination needs to be a shocker, but I sincerely hope we don't get more final games that are as unbalanced diegetically as something like Kylie versus Brad, VJ versus Charles, or Topaz versus Tino were. And until we get down to Final 8 or so, it's hard to imagine this getting better, as currently all of the main characters quote-unquote are still in. And if we get a Brad versus Drew or a Monica versus Olive in the first few boots of the merge, it's going to continue to be extremely obvious. The best thing Reality Resort could do for their first boot of merge, in my opinion, is have the final game be something like Topaz versus VJ or Marcus versus Brad, something where we could legitimately see either character go home. And beyond that, the absence of these characters feel felt. In all of Premerge, it felt as if none of the characters really left a huge impression aside from Kylie. And again, that's largely because of the fandom's near universal opinion that she was incredibly underutilized. It also doesn't help that aforementioned main characters often give the impression that victory for them in the final elimination games is a foregone conclusion. You see this mainly with Brad and VJ. However, I do have to shout out Topaz for showing the kind of fire and emotion I would be hoping to see from a quote-unquote main character in these types of situations. Additionally, in a cast of 16, it feels as if Brad, Marcus, Olive, and VJ at times can fit into that morally gray, knowing manipulator, manipulating people for their own games archetype. And while it isn't necessarily untrue for most cast of reality television to have about a quarter of them being this sort of knowing manipulator, willingly tricking people, it does feel as if we have too many characters who fit into that archetype. In shows like Big Brother or Survivor, a lot of times people will not knowingly try to manipulate people and maybe simply be really good socially or succeed in some other way. And there are ways to be strategic without manipulating them all in the same way. And I feel as if this brand of manipulation is a little overrepresented. Add to that of the 7 non-manipulator characters who are in Merge, all but Isidore is under at least one of their spells or an influence. It does feel as if most of the autonomy within the game is being concentrated on a very small portion of the cast currently. I'm sure what I've said so far might sound somewhat contradictory, with my praising of their well-rounded characters at one moment and then saying their characters are shafted in favor of strategy the next. And I think my complex feelings about Reality Resort really are, like, at the center of that contradiction. They consistently have done a great job of showing both characters' strengths and flaws and exploring these flaws thoroughly. So you get these interesting dynamic characters set up for a great story. However, it currently doesn't feel as if there is or will be any follow-through, if that makes sense. A few of the pre-merge eliminations, particularly the last 3, It felt as if their arcs and characters were somewhat dropped, with Kylie and Charles' storylines both feeling underdeveloped and rushed, and Tino feeling as if he didn't really have much to contribute to the plot beyond being a big, jockey body, which is a problem with two more interesting pre-mergers behind him. It feels as if he primarily existed to boost Topaz's spot in the story, and while that's not necessarily a problem, I sincerely hope that we get a better resolution from Topaz losing her closest ally and feeling alone and vulnerable than we did for the Kylie and Cheryl of it all. Also, I just want to do a quick aside on the legacy points I talked about earlier. I sincerely want to care and get interested and track people's points, but we don't know how many points anything is worth, and it can oftentimes feel arbitrary. I would love to just get an update on people's points at some point. Currently, it feels as if the point system is a way for the authors to arbitrarily choose who will come back for Reality Resort. And picking people arbitrarily wouldn't even be a bad thing. Plenty of shows do that for their All-Stars season. However, it feels weird and off when we're led to believe there's a point system that has some objectivity to it in some way than otherwise might be, but we never actually get to see how it mechanically works, beyond a few characters offhandedly mentioning their ranking on the leaderboard. Now onto a discussion of the animation. This isn't really my specialty, however I do have a few thoughts. I think one thing anyone can notice is that the animation in Reality Resort tends to change a bit throughout the pre-merge, though by the end they seem to have found their lane. To those of you who don't know, the first block were animated entirely in collaboration with the Disventure Camp team. Afterwards, they began animating it themselves. At first, when they started their own animation, it felt a little off, in my opinion. Every character was bouncy and somewhat overexpressive in a way that wasn't necessarily appealing to the eye, in my opinion. However, I think they did a great job of fine-tuning that and turning it down in the latter half, and I do really love the animation and visual style by Cycle 4 or so. Especially considering how hard it must be to gather a team of animators to emulate a style a different company had already completed must be. I think they've done a pretty good job. I just feel like it would be remiss of me to not at least comment on the way that the visual style tends to flow and change. Additionally, Reality Resort and Disventure Camp have both started this really intense cell shading of their thumbnails, and I'm not sure if it's just a trend lately, but I don't necessarily love it. But I mean, if everyone else is loving it, I may just be wrong. I don't know. Let me know what y'all think about that. Finally, I wanted to save this issue for last because it's probably my biggest issue with the show currently. The pacing for the pre-merge majorly suffered from the decision to make each block 2 episodes. I get why. They had dynamics they wanted to establish, and some of them took more episodes than a 1 block per episode format might allow. However, I would then suggest either having longer 1 episode blocks or having shorter 1 episode blocks with 1 or 2 non-elimination episodes mixed in. Disventure Camp frequently does non-elimination first episodes on their seasons, and I honestly think that would have massively helped this cast out here as well. Maybe having a block that's non-elimination, or if they were to go the 1 episode elimination route, simply having 1 episode and then doing the 1 episode blocks after that. The pacing also makes some of the aforementioned plot issues and eliminations even worse. Kylie was essentially the main character for 4 episodes straight before her immediate elimination, which while less bad on a rewatch, watching it live felt truly confusing, seeing Kylie be kind of an icon and one of the most important pillars as far as characters for Reality Resort for months of in-life time, and then after that, she's just immediately gone. It's a shame because most of the other issues would be very minor in isolation, but the pacing truly exacerbates it. Spending months between episodes and months on a single block only for Brad to obviously defeat Kylie or Topaz to obviously defeat Tino, because it's the only decision that the writers have laid any groundwork for to make sense. It's kind of sad. However, all of this discussion on the pacing leads me to say, I truly think Reality Resort's merge phase will be much better than the pre-merge for mainly 2 reasons. The first is that each episode in the merge will cover an entire block, and that'll force all of the gameplay to move much quicker. Secondly, for the most part, we're through with the characters who feel as if they have no win equity or storyline to get to the end that could result in a win other than maybe Drew or Annalise. The pacing being better will also make the majority of the problems I've discussed feel less pronounced. Additionally, the way the pre-merge ended with that fiery argument between almost the entire cast, coupled with nobody other than Brad seeming to give a shit that Topaz won, has set the merge up to have a very interesting start. That being said, though, we could really benefit from one of the 4 previously mentioned manipulative player archetypes being one of the first 2 boots of Merge. In order for me to consider this a great season, I need to be surprised by an elimination just once. And to end off my thoughts on the future on a high note, I am very, very, very excited for the musical episode. The last half of this video has been rather negative, so I just want to take a minute to reiterate, I've really enjoyed Reality Resort and hope Cove gets to complete the Reality Gauntlet. It is truly its own thing and vibe from Disventure Camp and Total Drama, both artistically and writing-wise, and more shows like this only make the niche stronger. I definitely recommend giving it a watch if you haven't yet. Anyways, thanks for making it to the end of the video. What should I talk about next? I've been trying to cover different media that I like before I talk about the same media twice, but I've kind of been considering making a video covering the first few episodes of Disventure Camp Fans vs. Favorites. Let me know if there's anything you'd be interested in. I've been thinking about covering object shows too. Hit all those buttons below. Bye bye!